Climate change, COVID-19 and the impact on the global economy topped this week's agenda at the World Economic Forum. We'll bring you the highlights. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. From calls for global unity to confronting climate change and the economic downturn, world leaders discussed an array of topics this week at the World Economic Forum. Unlike previous years, when political leaders, entrepreneurs and international activists converged on Davos in Switzerland, all of the meetings took place virtually because of the pandemic. CGTN's Andrew Wilson begins our coverage with this report from London.
It was the final day and much had already been said and agendas set out. But from the European Union, there was a final reminder that the challenges ahead are multidimensional and that as a bloc it recognised the need for more rather than less engagement.
For Europe to continue to grow, to sustain the level of prosperity, it's important that we are connected to this global growth, and for this we need open trade and investment.
Climate change dominated the 2021 forum. Nevertheless, a display of determination by the Prime Minister of Japan for a green and digital future was welcomed.
Regarding the electrified vehicles, by 2035, we will achieve 100% of electrified vehicles amongst the new passenger vehicle sales. And Japan will present an ambitious objective for 2030 before COP26.
The theme this year had been the Great Reset, a sustainable rebuild after COVID. But it was the resetting of geopolitics that aired some of the week's most memorable positions from a panel of experienced international diplomats.
My observation is that the current new U.S. administration needs time to estimate what are the areas it has to cooperate with China and what are the areas it needs to manage with China, avoiding conflicts. And for the Chinese side, I think we also need to reflect and observe what is the intention, what is the next move.
You know, the world is a very complicated place and reality is not clean cut. I always say reality is very messy. And I think the job of leaders at national level and global levels is to manage that messiness and find solutions that are beneficial to all. Win-win, understand each other, and try to find ways that are beneficial to all sides.
The challenges declared this week couldn't be greater. There was plenty of consensus, although no guarantees that long-term agreements would follow. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
For more on the Davos 2021 meetings, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Miami is John Quelch. He's the Dean of the University of Miami's Herbert Business School. Also with us from North Carolina is Klaus Larres. He is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. From Washington, D.C., Paul Bledsoe is an adjunct professorial lecturer with the Center for Environmental Policy at American University. And Changhua is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Clean Electrification. She joins us via Skype from Arlington in Virginia. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Changhua, let me start with you. The Chinese president, Xi Jinping, he addressed the World Economic Forum virtually earlier this week. He reaffirmed Beijing's very ambitious goals to slash carbon emissions and to achieve carbon neutrality. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I have announced China's goal to peak carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. And achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Meeting these targets will require tremendous hard work from China. Yet we believe that when the interest of the entire humanity is at stake, China must step forward, take action, and get the job done.
Changhua, as I said, you know, these are very ambitious goals, and given that China is still very highly dependent on fossil fuels, can these goals be achieved?
They have to be achieved. And so the timeline China has committed so far is actually it's not by 2030 to peak, it's before 2030. and achieving carbon neutrality before 2060. So creating enough space for China to aim higher and progressing its actions, deliveries as soon as possible. It is ambitious, but challenging to a large extent. And so we know China today, as you mentioned, still heavily relying on fossil fuels, particularly coal. If you look at emissions, we emit about 10 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year. So now the country is aiming to achieve the peaking maybe in the next 5 years, hoping to create a little bit more time between the peaking and down to net zero carbon neutrality in the next 30, 35 years. The challenging is one side is on timeline. China doesn't have the luxury actually to go progressively or step by step. Rather, this is more like really transformative steps and between the peaking and the carbon neutrality. So we need to figure out how to do that. On the other side, I think on the exciting side is the technologies. If you look at the renewable energy, energy storage, so we pretty much know what to do now, right? And so the challenge today is the pace and also figure out the cost of benefits. And because it's not for the environmental issues, we have to also consider about jobs and justice issues, and we still have a large population, 3 million people employed in the mining and the coal-fired facilities there. We have to make sure they are not left behind. So in a nutshell, I think the level of ambition is high, but in the meantime, it's the government has to be delivered. So China has to make the efforts. In the meantime, China has to work with the global community for that shared goal.
Paul Bledsoe, of course, there's a new administration in the White House right now. The Biden administration was very quick to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. The president has also suspended all new leases for oil exploration as well as fracking. Here's what the country's new climate czar, John Kerry, had to say. Let's listen.
So we're here now at this moment, not just because we understand the urgency or because we understand the moral imperative. We're here because we know we can't afford to lose any longer. And action is the one moral, economic, and scientific imperative worth contemplating. Let me just say to you, President Biden is totally committed to this fight.
So, Paul, we are, of course, aware that the United States has been able for the last 4 years when it comes to climate change. But as we just heard John Kerry tell us, President Biden is totally committed to this goal. What changes now?
Biden views climate change as the ultimate global security issue and as a domestic and international economic issue, which is why he's so focused on it. He views a clean energy infrastructure program, a $3 trillion proposal, as the way to jumpstart U.S. Employment. We have about 25 million people unemployed, as well as economic growth, as do Europe and China and other countries, and to bring down systemically, structurally bring down U.S. emissions quickly. So it's an ambitious program, but it's based in economics domestically, and then it's based in national security globally. If the climate is allowed to continue warming over the next several decades, we could destabilize the climate and put agriculture, water supply, migration, populations in immediate danger of destabilizing many nations and regions around the world. This is the ultimate national security issue. Biden knows that. That's why it's at the top of his agenda.
Paul, the president signed these new executive orders on oil exploration and also on fracking. That's been making political waves in the country, but how significant are those measures?
Those are just the beginning. What's coming is additional executive orders on raising the fuel economy of American automobiles, reducing the emissions from power plants, reducing methane emissions from oil and gas, coal, and from agriculture, reducing emissions from forests and farms. This is going to be an economy-wide effort, but it's going to be done sector by sector. That's the executive action. The hardest part is going to be getting Congress to pass legislation. Executive action will not be enough. We need to pass legislation. Republicans in Congress need to wake up to to the existential threat, as the president has called it, of climate change. If they don't act, there is a way that Democrats can do it just with 50 votes in the Senate, but we would prefer to do it in a more bipartisan way. And I think Biden understands that has to be the goal.
All right. Klaus, Larres, of course, the big issue that is preoccupying the world right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. It was also a big priority for those who addressed the World Economic Forum, especially the distribution of vaccines. We have several vaccines right now, and there are big challenges over the distribution of those vaccines. This is the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Let's listen.
The big risk now with the pandemic is that we all focus on ourselves first, when I speak for industrialized countries, and then we might ignore the development efforts. And that must not happen. That's why the German political goal, and also the goal in European spending, is to say very strongly, we will not save on development cooperation, but rather we must go the extra mile.
So, Klaus, that call by the German Chancellor was also echoed by the Chinese President Xi Jinping as well as the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you think there could be more global cooperation?
They definitely could. You know, COVAX has been introduced some time ago, and new President Biden has declared that the United States will join the COVAX initiative, which is good news, particularly for the developing world. But also within the Western world and the developed and industrialized countries, there is much more which can be done. You only have to look at Europe itself. There's a severe problem at the moment between the European Union and the UK about the vaccine from AstraZeneca. You know, they are arguing with each other who should get how many of these vaccines, and they are really seriously at loggerheads. So if even the European Union, with a former member, can't really get their act together, that tells you how difficult it is to really cooperate worldwide. There is something like vaccine nationalism. Each country wants to obtain the most vaccine for its own people and only reluctantly pass them on to other countries. You know, and I think that will be with us for quite some time. Once we have, we are all vaccinated, or let's say 2/3, 80% of the populations are vaccinated, then I think these countries will be much more prepared to give it to, let's say, the developing world, like African countries, countries in Latin America. Yeah. But at the moment, I think the Western world is really fighting among itself, and that example between the European Union and the UK is a very sad one, and they should really sort that out very, very quickly.
All right, Klaus, the fact that the United States has rejoined the World Health Organization, the WHO, does that make a big difference?
I think it does. You know, first of all, it's of course symbolic. It shows that the Biden administration is very serious with engaging with multilateralism. The same, of course, as with rejoining the Paris Climate Treaty. So it really gives out the right signals. But at the same time, countries are actually cooperating within the World Health Organization in a scientific way. They're exchanging information. They tell each other what vaccine developments have occurred, what is still needs to be done. And it's a good sign that the American delegation to the WHO is led by Dr. Fauci, who is probably the most respected vaccine expert in the United States, if not worldwide. So that really gives the right signals, and I think it will lead to greater global cooperation. And here China, of course, and the Europeans and the United States would be the leading members who really have to cooperate much better with each other and perhaps develop even a joint vaccine, rather having all these national vaccines, which then people are arguing about who is getting how many of these. So perhaps a global vaccine would be the right way forward.
All right, let's go to Miami, to John Quelch. John, let's talk about the global economy. Of course, COVID-19 has crippled economies around the world. If we look at China, China saw growth, very modest growth, 2.3% in 2020. That was the lowest growth rate since 1976. In the United States, GDP dropped 3.5%. This is a very early stage. I mean, the world is only now trying to get a real grip on COVID-19. But how long will it be before we see a return to robust growth?
Well, of course, that depends on the vaccination rate. It depends upon the restoration of consumer confidence and the ability of consumers to go about their normal daily business in restaurants, traveling, etc. But, you know, my belief is that by the third quarter of this year, we will see in United States and in Europe a considerable return to normal. I think that the distribution problems associated with the vaccine are going to be overcome. They are, of course, severe at the moment because the availability of supply is limited, and of course the degree to which there are obvious distribution throughputs in individual local communities, that still remains unresolved. Some states, some cities are doing a much better job than others. But I believe that by the third quarter we'll be back on track. Now, I think China is obviously back on track faster as a result of handling the virus a little bit more effectively. What I'm also concerned about is the developing and emerging economies. As has already been implied, there's been considerable economic disruption to those economies, and 500 million to 1 billion people may have been swept back into poverty as a result of that economic disruption. Those people we cannot afford to ignore, and as has been said, the availability of vaccines internationally as opposed to for domestic markets of the vaccine producers is a very important component to world stability. And China and Russia, for example, in Latin America, are already doing a strong job of supplying countries and cultivating goodwill through the supply of vaccine. So I would expect the American manufacturers and the European manufacturers to also be jogged by their own national governments to spread the vaccine more widely, as opposed to concentrating all doses in the immediate backyard.
Changhua, we saw tensions escalate, trade tensions escalate between China and the United States during the 4 years of the Trump administration. They were eased somewhat with the signing of that first trade deal. But how essential will it be going forward for these two countries to start cooperating with each other?
Well, trade will continue to be very important of the vehicle for the two largest economies to work with each other, and also actually not only limited to the two largest economies themselves, but also for the rest of the world, creating literally job opportunities, growth opportunities for others there. I think from China's side, it's a sort of wait and see a moment, because President Biden just took office and he has his plate really, really full. I'm delighted that he rejoined, Paris Agreement, and there should be more talks, hopefully, with the Chinese president as soon as possible. I do not have the timeline at this moment. I think early on, listening to what Fu Ying said, in one of the sessions there on the geopolitics there, I don't think it's a good thing, for the two sides just to guess, each other, what's on each other's mind at this moment. Rather, we need to reopen the channel of communication as soon as possible, so that the two countries will start to work together. By saying that, I am fully aware of the challenges. I think trade is more and more becoming an instrument, a tool actually for countries to contend each other. Right? There are issues, national security issues, technology issues, around the digital technologies, energy security, among others. But it's more important and more urgent than ever. The two largest economies need to sit together and figuring out how to work out some sort of deals. We don't have to totally say open up, but somehow we need to find a common ground to work with each other. This is going to be a very important part of the recovery. As I said, it's not only going to benefit the two countries themselves, but also benefit the rest of the world.
Paul Bledsoe, both China and the United States played huge roles in drawing up the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, shortly after Donald Trump came to office, he took the United States out of that accord. Now they're back in the accord. So now that Joe Biden has made this such an important part of his agenda, can we see more? Do you expect there to be more cooperation between China and the United States on this issue, climate change?
I do, Anand. John Kerry said as much this week. Kerry said that whatever our differences on security and trade issues, that we have to work together on climate change. He used the word silo, that we would silo climate change apart from those other more contentious issues and still find a way to work together on climate change. It's worth noting that President Biden announced a global summit at the White House on climate change, April 22nd, Earth Day. He recognizes this is the premier national challenge, along with the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis facing the world today. Biden is an internationalist. He hopes to work with the Chinese on technology policies and other ways to reduce not just U.S. and Chinese emissions, but as was said before, global emissions. I will note, however, that the U.S. has taken a much more ambitious emissions reduction target than China has, and that Biden, for 2025, and Biden has pledged to take an even more ambitious emissions reduction target for 2030. I think there's going to be growing international pressure on China to reduce its emissions before 2030. I think they need to reduce their emissions by 2025. I expect John Kerry and President Biden to press this point with China, but to help them do so with joint technology.
Paul, you mentioned Earth Day, that gathering taking place April 22nd. There's also another meeting which comes up in May, and that is the so-called Singapore Davos meeting. There could be face-to-face meetings between the Chinese and the Americans at that time. Do you expect there to be anything substantive on the table by May?
I do. I think there are opportunities, as I said, in technology cooperation. There are opportunities in super pollutant mitigation. As you know, China and the U.S., together with India and others, got the Kigali Agreement to phase out HFCs, one of 6 principal greenhouse gases. Now it's time we started focusing on methane and black carbon, which must be cut if we're going to prevent runaway warming. And I also think that the G7 meeting hosted by the UK in Cornwall in June will be another opportunity for global leaders to get specific about how they're going to cut both CO2 emissions and these super pollutants, which turn out to be the key to reducing near-term warming, so that we don't have tipping points on a global scale that in the natural systems allow the climate to destabilize.
Klaus, Larres, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, he also addressed the World Economic Forum virtually. It was the first time he's done that in 12 years. And Putin called for better relations with the European Union. And we know that relations are not so good right now. How is the EU likely to respond to that call?
Well, I think everyone would like to have better relations with Russia if it was possible. The European Union has quite a few grievances, and they still refer to Ukraine and to the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Nothing has changed here. The status quo is still as it is. There's still a war scenario going on in eastern Ukraine, and the EU believes that Putin could do something about it. And of course, only recently we had the poisoning of the opposition politician Navalny in Russia, who had then to go to Germany to recover. Now he's back in Russia, but he immediately was arrested. And that has, of course, caused a lot of opposition protests in support of Navalny. And all that situation is really put at the feet of Putin, that Putin probably was responsible for having organized that poisoning, that he really doesn't accept any opposition to his rule at all. And the European Union is very, very unhappy about that. So if that position was to improve regarding Navalny, regarding Ukraine, possibly Crimea, then of course the European Union and individual countries like Germany would be more than happy to engage with Putin again. There are also other problems, but of course, regarding climate change and also regarding the pipeline, Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, there are also areas of cooperation going on. So it's not all just conflict and enmity. There are some areas of cooperation, but I think in order to improve Russian-European relations decisively, the issues I just mentioned, not least the Navalny case, need to be resolved. And it is really in Putin's power to do that.
John Quelch, we look at COVID-19. It's also had quite a devastating impact on world hunger. There was a report out by the United Nations World Food Programme which said that the number of people on the brink of starvation globally has doubled from 135 million people to 270 million people. What does that tell us about how this pandemic has impacted global supply chains?
Well, I think, first of all, that the increase in the level of hunger in the world is a serious issue that all developed nations have to take account of, particularly because we know that hopelessness is the harbinger of terrorism, and we do not want to aggravate or re-aggravate that particular problem. But I think that supply chains, while they were disrupted by the pandemic, proved to be more resilient than one might have expected. And I think this is partly because the Chinese economy recovered quite quickly. And the motivation there, I think, on the part of China was to ensure that the supply chains that it did have into export markets would not be put out of commission for a length of time that would motivate the implementation of alternative sources of supply. So while some supply chain activity did move to Vietnam or India, relatively marginal shifts, China was able to get back on track fast enough to keep its supply chains intact. Supply chains out of emerging markets, though, have been much more subject to disruption.
Changhua, you wrote a recent article in which you said that halving emissions by 2030 and achieving near zero by 2050 cannot be achieved without global cooperation. Explain that to us, because as we've just seen here in the United States, the US played a big role in the Paris Climate Accord, then the new president took it out of the Paris Accord.
We all learned the lessons by just witnessing the coming out of the international mechanism by the U.S. So we learned lessons. But back to the question you asked me, the world is very much globalized, right? And if you look at Chinese economy, so yes, of course, now we are more focusing on this dual circularity because it's shifting context of the global situations there. So China definitely is making more efforts to grow domestic. But in the meantime, there is a big part of the economy is with global, right? If you look at global flows, yes, through trade, through investment, it's about the fossil fuels, about energy, about materials. Circularity becomes a big part of the solutions there. But anyway, I think even just from emissions perspective, so global effort is required. In the meantime, we have to work out to find joint solutions there.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.